I suspect there are a couple of reasons why a Canadian born shortly before 9/11 would have heard of that, but not 11M or 7/7. The first, more obvious ones being that, the US is your neighbor, though of course you are part of the Commonwealth, so you would expect 7/7 to be taught, as well as the scope of the attack. 9/11 was much larger, but I think there's more to it than that. Number one, both Spain and the UK experienced a lot of terrorist attacks before this over the decades. And one generous explanation that the US, having experienced fewer, or at least having experienced fewer on its own land, experienced something very new or novel for itself. A more cynical read could be that the US, having kind of entirely shaped and defined its identity in the years following 9/11, based on its victimization on that day, would be less inclined to acknowledge the fact that others have been victimized in similar ways. That in many ways, the US was not unique in this sort of experience. And as one sort of very minor example to help illustrate this, my school, which is international but was very heavily American, 1 year after 9/11 said like, hey, everyone wear red, white, and blue to commemorate and mourn the loss of American lives. And I said, I'm gonna wear black because I'm going to mourn the loss of human lives. Yes, I was a bratty 12-year-old, but I also don't think I was wrong, because it was more than just Americans that were lost that day, and it wasn't the fact that they were Americans that made it a tragedy. However, there is another potential explanation, and this is something that I think probably plays an even larger part in it. But if you acknowledge that 11M and 7/7 were reactionary, were in fact carried out as a form of retribution for perceived Western provocation, that might introduce an uncomfortable idea. And it might prompt people in the West to ask, okay, so does that mean that 9/11 was in reaction to something too? And that is the most dangerous question anyone could ask, because it ruins the narrative. And just to be clear, I'm not saying that any part of it was okay. I'm not defending it. But part of the narrative is that it was completely unprovoked and out of the blue. That the US had never done anything to harm anyone. That hate for the US was based on the American way of life, American freedom and democracy, when it could in fact just be a reaction to something else. Could be that the US made people angry, not because it had freedom, but because it did something to harm them. Maybe it's not as simple as the ideology begets hate, but rather that the hate and anger begets the ideology. And lastly, if it is in fact all a reaction, does that mean that if the US invades a country now, that could beget another reaction in the future? And once a population starts thinking that way, it's hard to get them to support your wars.